Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today I'm talking to Vern Hughes, an Australian historian and activist who, back in 1988, actually founded the Australian Association for Armed Neutrality. You can imagine how excited I am about this one. David, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal. It's very good to have this conversation.
I'm very glad that you reached out. And can you maybe tell us a little bit about your Association for Armed Neutrality? How did that come about? And then what happened once the Cold War kind of ended?
Well, back in the 1980s, I, like many people of my generation around the world, was involved in the nuclear disarmament movement of the time. We felt that not only in Australia but across Europe and North and South America that we were close to a nuclear war. That Cold War hostilities meant it was not inconceivable that nuclear weapons could be used, and there was a huge mobilization of opinion across the world about that prospect of nuclear disarmament. I was involved in that, as were many people. And then in 1984, as I was involved in that movement and thinking strategically about how to make some progress politically, an Australian of Hungarian background named David Martin wrote a book which was called Armed Neutrality for Australia. And this was published in 1984. And David was not an expert on defence or security. He was a writer of fiction and poetry. But he had an interesting view about the importance of issues of war and peace, and how most people feel paralyzed in thinking too seriously about issues of war and peace because we're inclined to think, oh, we're not experts in this area. We don't know much about it. We better leave it to people who are experts in the field. And I was very impressed when David said, no, I'm a writer of poetry and fiction, but I know a lot about war and peace because I've lived through a lot of it. I'm as entitled as anyone to have an opinion about this. And I want to put my voice forward, and I want all of us to put our voices forward in thinking about how we can move towards a world that is more secure, more peaceful. And this particular book talked about the concept of neutrality in a way that grabbed my attention because it was strategic in its thinking. It was from beginning to end, it was strategic. It was saying, yes, we live in a perilous world. Yes, we live in a country that is entangled through military alliances with one of the two superpowers. There's nothing intrinsic about that. It's a historical thing. It's evolved. It can be undone. It can be varied. It can be changed. It just needs people to think strategically about how to do that and how to organize politically to make that happen. And in 1984, that was precisely the kind of thing I wanted to be thinking about, because I was concerned about how all of the energy that was involved in the nuclear disarmament movement and in related movements of that kind could be developed strategically to lead to a more perilous world. So that was the beginning of my thinking. Then we proceeded in 1988 to organize, to start holding functions, to speak on the topic of neutrality. And I found myself, as an Australian historian, but with no particular expertise in defence and foreign policy or military matters. My expertise was in 19th century Australia in our social development. And so I found myself giving talks at staff colleges of the Air Force, the Navy and the Australian Army. And that was a big learning curve for me, but also a step into a world that I knew nothing about. and it was fascinating, but at the same time also rather disturbing, because when you step into the military world, you realize, wow, this really is another world. This is like stepping into a bubble, quite disconnected from the rest of society. That raises many questions for a policy person. But nevertheless, it was engaging. And for a couple of years, we had quite a big public debate about armed neutrality for Australia. And then in 1991, the Cold War came to an end. The Soviet Union dissolved. And at that time, that marked the end of our little period of activism for neutrality. The question was, well, okay, after that, are these issues still relevant? Will they become redundant? That was a question we wrestled with. And here we are now, 30 odd years later, when the question of neutrality is being revived around the world. People are looking at it in fresh eyes. And I'm very excited about that, because I feel in some sense as though I'm taking up a conversation that I started 30 years ago, and I want to get to the end of the conversation now.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. It's quite interesting. A lot of people misunderstand neutrality as a concept of another form of peace, but actually neutrality is a child of war, because it only makes sense within the context of a conflict. And actually, once conflict rises, the most natural thing to happen is that exactly what you are doing. Like, people start having the idea of, oh, why don't we go neutral? And conflicts give birth to certain neutralities, and conflicts kill certain neutralities. And actually, I think Australia is actually a prime candidate for maybe a real actual future neutrality, because like currently you're in an alliance. Currently everything is done in tandem with the Americans, and what I know from also the conversations I had, for instance, with Professor Hugh White, is that the Australian security apparatus thinks security solemnly within the framework of the US alliance and of deterrence, right? But correct me if I'm wrong, but when you start thinking about neutrality also from a very personal point of view and just from a rational point of view, actually deterrence is not really what you start with, is it?
What I start with, and I can say this looking at the map of the world behind you, that down in the bottom right-hand corner, we see Australia and New Zealand. And that the obvious thing about that is that we are right at the edge of your map, or at the bottom of the world. And for several generations of Australians and New Zealanders, we grew up looking at that map of the world, and we were encouraged to think, oh my God, we're so isolated. We are at the end of the world. We're on the opposite side of the world to Europe. We're a long way from anywhere. And we thought that meant isolation and vulnerability. Now I think we look at the map of the world and we think, we are so lucky. We are safely removed from the conflicts of the world. We are a long way from the Persian Gulf. This is a good thing. We're a long way. We are a long way from Ukraine. This is a good thing. So I think part of my story, and I think the Australian story in general, is that because we are a colonial settler society, where transplanted people were brought from Europe, placed on the other side of the world, for a long period, we thought we were isolated. We were alone. We were vulnerable. We were there to be picked off by an aggressor from the Northern Hemisphere. And in the 1870s, who do you think was the principal potential aggressor for Australia? Would you be surprised if I said it was the Russians? In I live in the city of Melbourne, which is on a bay, on the headlands which separate the bay from the ocean. A series of cannons were built at the top of those cliffs in the 1870s, and they were to deter the Russians.
Really? You're serious about this?
The Russians, yes.
The Australians wanted to deter the Russians all the way in the 1870s.
1870s, the Russians. And this is extraordinary. But that's how we thought. Then a bit later, after the turn of the century, it was the Chinese. And then the Chinese have loomed large for the last 120 years. But it was the Russians before that. And that's quite absurd when you think about it, but it seemed kind of natural for several generations of Australians to think in that way. The point is, it is unbelievably absurd now to think about that. But nevertheless, our geography has meant that we've had this strange ambivalence about where we sit in the world, whereby we initially thought we were very vulnerable. Then, as we've become used to our own circumstances and come to think that Australia is actually home, not just a temporary assignment somewhere from home, we've become used to this, and we've come to embrace the fact that actually there may be big strategic advantages for us in being on a landmass at the bottom of the world surrounded by vast oceans, which are almost unnavigable unless you are a very, very big naval power. So I guess for me, the interesting thing is to think now what those facts of geography mean for trying to think about our place in the world in 1926, when the rest of the world is incredibly perilous, when there are conflicts erupting all over the place. How will we contribute to that situation? How will we be impacted from it? And it might be that a neutral Australia is the best possible option for us.
I mean, the biggest danger of being an ally, of course, especially of one of the great powers, is that you're sucked into conflicts that you don't want to go into. The danger is not so much that people will come and fight a war in Australia, but that Australians will be enlisted in order to go and fight the wars of the Americans. I mean, is this something that is currently on the minds of people in Australia that's like, oh, we'd rather not go and die in the Persian Gulf for the US empire, or, who look at Ukraine and go a little bit like, yeah, well, Russia kind of went in there with their soldiers, but there was a pre-story to that. How is that currently unfolding in the national debate in Australia?
Well, as in most countries of the world, we have a big disconnect between our political class and the population. So the opinion polls at the moment show basically 73% of Australians oppose the war in the Persian Gulf, 23% support it. When asked who's to blame, 62% of Australians say Donald Trump. But we have a kind of unanimity amongst the political class, which we always have on these issues, which says we support the United States. We don't want to be involved materially, but we will lend support at a political level to the United States. Even though that position is quite disconnected from public opinion, nevertheless, that's how the political argument goes. But having said that, there are still dissenting voices, so that the interesting thing, I think, is that the gap between the opinion of the political class and the opinion of the society has never been bigger. It's very hard to find any informed person who will fess up to being a supporter of the war in the Persian Gulf. And yet most of the political class will go along with that position. But there is one very important dissenter, and this is important to note. In our main Conservative Party, which has always been very a pro-US alliance. Its prospective new leader, alternative leader, is a guy with a military background who has said he opposes this war. It's a crazy war. It would be far too dangerous for Australians to be involved in any way. And this is a major development because this signals a real break in the official orthodoxy, and it signals that it is possible, I think, for a new vision of Australian security to emerge out of this mess.
Who is that, and how big is his wing of the party, of the Conservative Party at the moment?
Well, the party is called the Liberal Party, and this individual is named Andrew Hastie, and he is a military person with a military background. He was in special forces, fought in Afghanistan. So he comes to this issue with some authority, and basically last weekend he outlined these views, and the overwhelming response from most people was, at last, a politician who was actually saying what the rest of us are thinking. Mm-hmm. This is a big breakthrough, I think. So, and interestingly, he is from the right of his party. He is someone who you would nominally think would be towards the hard right. Yeah. But what's interesting about that, I think, is that this really shatters our notions of left and right. And I think this is a very interesting current in the whole debate about war and peace around the world. The traditional notions of left and right, which we've inherited and which we accepted as normal for so long, are really breaking down. And in that breakdown, I think there's a real possibility that for countries like Australia, the neutrality option is one that can potentially be the best fit if your interests are in national sovereignty. If you really are interested in national sovereignty, then you may be from the right or you may be from the left, but this is the best way forward. And I'm really interested in that coming together of left and right.
No, this is a wonderful observation, and actually, this is there are very similar political developments happening in Europe, in South America, in a lot of places actually, and it's the one spot where they can meet: the sovereignist right, the people who would like to have an independent and secure place, and Australia for the Australians, that kind of things. As in, and Australians don't go to Afghanistan to kill Afghans, right? It's like we just stay at home, then nobody comes to us neither. We don't bomb their houses, so they don't come here. That type, plus the kind of the Marxist left and even the pacifist left, because actually, while armed neutrality, of course, is always armed, it's the basic idea of armed neutrality is we will not fight wars outside. We will use weapons only if somebody comes here and tries to invade, which is, in the international sphere, it's actually a pacifist concept. And not on the personal sphere, because personally still means you need people under arms, which these pacifists here might oppose. But at least in the international scene, it means like Australia would be a pacifist country the way that Switzerland has been for 200 years, or Austria for the last 80 years, and so on, right? So it's you bring two sectors together that together might well make up more than 50% of the population, which in theory in a democracy should be impetus to move toward that route, right? Do you see on the left actually interest in the concept?
There's an interest in neutrality, but it's there's a pacifist current. Mm-hmm. You see, in the Marxist left, yes, there is an interest in the concept of neutrality. And they're kind of edging towards the idea that, yes, that will mean an independent defense capacity for the country. That's new territory for them, but they're kind of edging towards it. We have a big Green Party. The Green Party remains pacifist left, I would say. And it is, it's very reluctant to embrace the debate about what kind of defence capacity will we need. But nevertheless, those are the currents on the left. What's interesting is that, is that there are currents on the right which are now very interesting. And for people on the right, this is linked to economic arguments about the economic trends that have happened in Australia, but also in comparable Western countries over the period of globalization. We have gone through a period of deindustrialization, as many Western countries have, where we used to have a significant manufacturing industry. It's largely been dismantled over the past 40 years. So our capacity to have a viable defence capability is much reduced because our infrastructure in manufacturing, in energy, self-reliance, our communication self-reliance, these things have taken a hit, partly through the impact of neoliberalism and partly through the globalization of all of these things in the last 40 years. But nevertheless, you have people on the right now saying it has been a mistake to deindustrialize. This places us in a very precarious position because we don't have the capability to defend ourselves. So we need to build up some self-reliance. This means breaking with globalization in many ways, rebuilding some of the manufacturing capacity that we tore down. And this is a very significant strand of opinion on the right, because that then opens up points of engagement with people in the centre and left, and that's a very interesting debate. So in a way, the globalization period of the last 40 years prevented neutrality from being assessed as a viable option for us, because economically it kind of wasn't doable, and militarily it wasn't needed because we were so thoroughly enmeshed in the American military structure that for a period it seemed perhaps it doesn't matter if we deindustrialize. We'll be part of the American empire. We'll build our security system around that. That's okay. But of course, that's all come tumbling down under Trump.
And in general, under the development of the United States over the last 20 years, right? I mean, blaming Trump for everything, like, is kind of excusing Obama and Bush and Clinton and so on from the route the United States took, and which used to look like extremely like responsible, being the policeman of the world, and now we just see like, oh no, wait, it's just the mafia boss of the world, right? and that's not that appealing anymore, this model. Now the question I would have a bit is this notion, of, I think the strongest counter argument to neutrality is, and probably always will be, but if we're alone, then we cannot defend ourselves against each and every threat possible, right? The Europeans at the moment, even the Swiss, and I'm very outraged at that, argue that only if we work together we can defend ourselves against all threats, right? It's like, what do you mean all threats? As in, if aliens come tomorrow, you want to be able to nuke them out of the sky? It's like, but this idea that you need to be able to win basically you need to be able to win a nuclear war, and that starting from that thinking, then going down and saying like neutrality is kind of is not an option. So how do you counter that kind of thinking? Because I'm pretty sure it must be there in Australia and New Zealand as well, right? This idea that, oh no, the threats are so large, we cannot do this alone. We cannot.
Well, yes, and I mean, but again, there's now such turmoil in these debates. In a sense, there's been such disruption to the way the debate used to run. I mean, 10 years ago, the right was very worried about China.
Right.
And even though Australia is overwhelmingly dependent on trade with China, for our well-being, our biggest trading partner. Nevertheless, the right would often say China is a principal threat. It's now emerging as an aggressor nation, is a principal threat to Australia. Interestingly, that line of argument was politically unsustainable for them, because one of the things that's happened in Australia in the last 40 years is that we now have a big Chinese population in the country. We have about 1 million Chinese people who've been here for less than 30 years. They tend, as most migrant communities do, they tend to congregate in particular localities. And those localities do not vote for the right now. The right thought that the Chinese would vote for them because they thought they would be anti-communist. But surprise, surprise, the Chinese turn out to not like talk about war with China. They don't like. They really
surprise, yeah.
So electorally, those areas do not vote for the right anymore. They've switched across to the left, and the right is quite shocked by this. So it's produced a kind of conundrum for the right, because they say then, if we continue to think that China is the principal threat, it's an aggressive nation, and it really is intent on invading Australia, they worked out that politically, that's a major problem with not only the Chinese community, but with a lot of other Asian and other immigrant communities in Australia. So that's it's a very interesting twist to the story, but it's a very strong one, because it effectively has caused the right into a whole lot of turmoil, because they realize, well, which do we really want the Chinese votes, or do we really want war with China? We're going to have to choose.
This is very interesting, because at the end of the day, on the ideological level, or the constructivist level, actually, neutrality has always had this component that it is able to integrate several kind of competing identities. I mean, for the Swiss case, the most obvious thing is that in the First World War, we almost fell apart because the German speakers had sympathies with Germany, and the French speakers with French, and then the government invested actually a lot into saying, like, look, we are neutral, therefore we are just Swiss, right? And we cry about the dying that's happening around us, but we won't participate because we're different. And in this sense, it has this sovereignist element. And for Australia, it could do exactly the same, right? It's like, okay, we are white and black and Filipino and Chinese, but we're all at the end of the day Australians, and we're neutral. So we will, if something happens outside, then we will try to help as much as we can everybody, but we won't join the fight of anyone, because we are ourselves over here, right? So there's a huge ideological actually possibility there to keep also the country together, because the last thing you would want is a goddamn civil war over like some outside shenanigans.
Yes, and we have already. I mean, that's exactly right. Australia is extraordinarily ethnically diverse.
Yeah.
I think in the city of Melbourne, 37% of our 5 million people were born overseas. 37% were born in another country out of 5.4 million people. So this is, and just 3 years ago, it was 31%. 3 years before that, it was 27%. So it's growing up very rapidly. As part of that diversity, we have a big Jewish population, and we have a big Arab population, and a big Muslim population. The Muslim population is about 1 million people now. We have about 500,000 Jewish people. Melbourne, actually, is another demographic fact. The biggest residential congregation of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel is Melbourne. So there's a strong pro-Israel lobby here, which is based on a very big arrival of Holocaust survivors who came to Melbourne after the war. From the 1970s on, we also had a big influx of Arab and Muslim populations. And of course, not surprisingly, over the course of the last 2 years, these communities have been at loggerheads. There's been enormous tension. And both are wanting to influence the policies of an Australian government. The pro-Israel people in a very brazen, not very subtle way, the Muslim people in ways that are just much more ineffective than the pro-Israel lobby, but they're trying to influence the Australian government. Now, I say, as an advocate of neutrality, because we have Jewish people and because we have Muslim people and because we have very significant Arab communities who are not big fans of the state of Israel, for the sake of coherence in Australia, we have to accept that individually you might be pro-Israel, or you might be pro-Palestine, or you might be pro-Muslim, or you might be pro-Jewish, but at the level of the Australian government, we cannot overtly take sides. We have to accept that we are a diverse population with diverse attitudes, and so our interest will be always in de-escalation, mediation, trying to resolve conflicts, rather than backing Israel or backing Hamas or Hezbollah. We're going to have to say, as a neutral nation, no, we're going to have to take a position which is conducive to our cohesion as a nation, and that means reining in some of our ideological instincts for the sake of a kind of pragmatic national purpose, which is not a lot different from what I understand of the Swiss situation, as you described, where you're a multilingual country. You have to enable those different lingual groups to cohere.
Yeah, coherence is very, very important. And actually, the counter argument then usually is, oh, but there's evil happening. And if you don't oppose evil, then you help evil. So, and the funny thing is that both groups will tell you that. The pro-Israel group will tell you, if you're not on the side of us, then you're on the side of Hamas. Not supporting us is akin to supporting Hamas. And actually, the pro-Palestine people will tell you that if you do not go to oppose the genocide, and I think it is a genocide, it absolutely is. But if you do not oppose it, then you're basically condoning it and helping it. And in a sense, it puts you both on both ends. It puts you in a very similar position. And in a way, this criticism. This criticism won't go away. So the question is, if on the foreign policy level, if this kind of then the neutral stance, in order to maintain coherence internally and to avert being sucked into foreign conflicts externally, if that starts emerging as a natural kind of way of trying to balance inside outside and the different groups, which at the end of the day leaves everybody dissatisfied. But that's usually where the balance then lies. I find this fascinating that you can describe this also in these local dynamics. So the neutrality discussion itself, did it actually now pick up on steam, and your group and the people around you who are working on this, are they kind of coming together again now after 30 years? What's the situation?
Yes. Well, yes, it's an irony, but as the conflict of the last 2 years in Israel and Palestine has erupted, and now with the war in Iran, but more generally, I guess, over the last few years with the emergence of Trump as a volatile, unpredictable leader of a nation that Australia has historically been aligned with. There's a lot of debate. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean then to be aligned with a nation which is led by a narcissist who cannot be predicted, who will act on a whim? This surely is a major threat to our security to be aligned with something that is so unpredictable. So that's been a really interesting point of debate, I think. Completely unresolved. And it's, of course, we're in the middle of a war in the Persian Gulf in which all of those things are in the air, where we have domestic price hikes in energy, which is the practical implication of all of that. And so the debate is, all over the place and running in very unpredictable directions because it's such unpredictable territory for us. But nevertheless, it is true that in that debate, there's been a revival of interest in the idea of neutrality, and what, and the question is not so much whether neutrality is feasible for us, because I think from the geopolitical standpoint, neutrality is quite a feasible option for us. All of the geopolitical arguments are quite strong for us. Our locality in the world means it's a strong argument. Our internal demographic situation means that there's a strong case for being neutral and therefore not engaged in the conflicts of the world as a way of holding together our diverse ethnic communities. So there's a terrific debate about all of this stuff now, which is fantastic. The irony is that it takes war and conflict to get this debate going.
Yeah.
But that's the reality, I think.
Yeah, and that's just the dynamic that it is. I mean, you start rethinking this and start thinking options once the need for it arises. Maybe and I just want to add to the discussion we had previously. One answer to people who say like, "Oh, you need to support us," is to say like, "Look, the first duty we have is to do no harm. So the best thing a neutral country can do when others are in conflict is to not send them weapons, to not pour gasoline into the fire, right? And that in and of itself is already something. Even if you yourself can't stop the fighting, you can at least make it harder for those who do to do that. And that's not to say that we should take away the right of the Palestinians to resist, but at least try to help with humanitarian goods and not with weapons, which is exactly the opposite of what the Western states did, of course, right? They poured weapons in for Israel to do the mass slaughter and so on. So not supplying weapons is already a humanitarian action. But one more question about this change of the perception of the Australians of like where they are in the world, because I always wondered, this idea that you're far away from the rest, right, is intimately linked with Australia being a settler, a colonial a project of the United Kingdom, of course, because you're far away from the UK. But if you look at the map, we're very close to East Timor. You're very close to Indonesia. You are basically the southern tip of Southeast Asia, right? Is that kind of perception of, oh, we are actually we're kind of an Asian nation? Is that rising at the moment or not?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And this is this is a very fundamental divide in the society now, because yes, the British imperial heritage and the settler colonial project meant a strong pro-British sentiment, which was very strong for a long period of time, possibly until the late 1960s. And at the same time, since the 1960s, immigration has opened up to Asian countries, where until the end of the 1960s, you may not be aware, we had for a long period, for almost a century, we had an official immigration program in Australia, which was called, and I kid you not, the White Australia Policy.
Oh.
And the White Australia Policy meant that we accepted immigrants from Europe and from South America, providing they were white. Now, there were Lebanese. Sometimes there were court cases for the Lebanese about whether they were white or sufficiently white to get in.
Insane.
It actually happened. It really is. But in 1967, the White Australia Policy officially came to an end. And that meant that most of the immigration since then has been from Southeast Asia, China, Vietnam, South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and a declining European component. So are we an Asian society now? Well, we're a kind of Eurasian / Pacific society.
Mhm.
It's clumsy as a term, but that somewhere in that is what we will be in the future, a kind of hybrid, multi-ethnic, kind of unique mix of all of these things. But neutrality, I think, is a good platform for sustaining this kind of
Kind of good basket to kind of catch all kind of thing, right? And the funny thing actually is just like to get to neutrality might be a political struggle, but once you're actually there, it starts to encrust itself very, very quickly. It actually takes a lot to get rid of it again, which is why we need to study the case of Sweden and Finland so strongly, because there they said goodbye to it and seem not to regret it, although they painted a big bullseye on their backs, right? In terms of it's absolute stupidity in terms of geopolitical realism, right? But we need to study how that went, because it was a process of deprogramming, basically. But in a sense, what I'm hearing from you is that Australia is kind of naturally moving in the other direction. Do you hear any voices that are really worried about this? Like there are always the die-hard U.S. alliancist kind of, especially in the think tanks. No, we together in arms, brothers in arms, one for all, D'Artagnan, one for all for one.
Yes, but the exciting thing is that there is a long-term trajectory here of kind of demographic change, and with it, change in attitudes, and it's a very well-established trend. So the reason I'm very excited, really, about the evolution of Australia in this period, and why I'm excited about the idea of neutrality, is that all the opinion polls show that in attitudes to these questions, attitudes to defense, foreign policy, the American alliance, the war in Iraq, attitudes to Israel, Palestine, there is such a deep generational divide. The population over 50 still the residual pro-empire, pro-British Empire / US Empire, ethnically white, that is there. But the population under 50 is dramatically thinking differently. And as you go down, the population under 30, no interest in British or US imperialism, don't know what it means, don't like it, don't like the sound of it. It seems antiquated. And the idea of Australia as a multi-ethnic, unique mix of peoples in a safe corner of the world, this is kind of the natural way that younger people think.
It's kind of appealing. It's an appealing way of thinking about your country, actually. Yeah.
I think it's very good, and New Zealand even more so, because again, if you look at that map behind you, New Zealand has got a buffer which separates them from Asia, and that's Australia. And it is a big buffer there. So they are even, as we say, they are even more in a luxuriously safe part of the world than Australia. Any potential aggressor has to come via Australia to get to New Zealand, and that's a big ask. So New Zealand, you've always had quite strong pacifist opinion. In fact, in the 1990s, there was a right wing political party formed in New Zealand, which was significantly backed by the business establishment, and they wanted a Costa Rican position, that is essentially no army.
Yeah, and Costa Rica is officially neutral. Actually, they have it in their constitution.
and these were very hard-nosed business people who said, actually, a defence force is just not rational for us. It's a waste of money.
Trouble.
That hasn't prevailed. The governments of New Zealand haven't adopted that. But the fact that could emerge in the business community is quite interesting, because it reflects that thinking, and that we don't have that thinking in Australia. But it's interesting that it occurred in New Zealand, and it's still there in that society, but it's not. It hasn't filtered through to government policy.
And the interesting thing is, there's even more potential, because if you go the other way and you go to Indonesia, I mean, the current president is actually one of the most neutralist presidents they've had in a long time. And I know for a fact that their policy establishment is actually also thinking about, especially about neutrality, non-alignment. And if you go further up, Malaysia is doing the same. Malaysia is even actively saying, look, ASEAN neutrality is our strongest kind of asset, which is still part of their foreign policy, one of the pillars of their foreign policy top fund, the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, still one of the pillars of ASEAN, kind of as a grouping and so on. So, and although these are very different kind of conceptualization of what it means to be neutral for what kind of purpose and so on, I mean, very different understandings. But the potential for cooperation all across this stretch of the world is actually very, very large. So in a sense, the natural progression of the entire region, and Australia and New Zealand is one of them, is actually intuitively makes a lot of sense, and not just in the idealist way, but really in a realist kind of, this is probably the way that thinking's going to evolve among different groups of people, whether we tell them or not.
Absolutely. I think the spanner in the works, I guess, in the last 20, 30 years has been China.
As a threat perception, right? As a other.
If you're inclined to think China is an aggressor nation or a potentially aggressor nation, then you'll be inclined to think that the countries of Southeast Asia need to work together militarily to restrain China. If you're, on the other hand, if you think that China is essentially an economic competitor to the United States, and a quite aggressively competitive economy, intent on growing and extending its economic sphere as much as possible, but with no real military intent to engage in a negative way with neighboring countries, then yes, I think the whole of the Southeast Asia region is a region that, just for whom neutrality will make perfect sense. And as you move further away from North Asia, it makes perfect sense to say we should keep all great power military interference out of our part of the region, as much as we can do that. And that makes a lot of sense for many of the countries in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you don't cooperate. On the opposite, you cooperate wherever you can with everybody, including the United States, including China, including Russia. I mean, wherever you can and want to. Yeah, so I'm very positively surprised to hear that so many factors inside Australia actually play into the kind of a natural progression toward a neutrality policy. Now, are you advocating for neutrality to be put into the constitution. The Maltese made that point to me, saying like, look, it needs to go into the constitution, otherwise it's out of the window whenever the political wind changes? Or do you think it would be enough to just have kind of a foreign policy, even if it wasn't called that, even if it was called like multi-alignment or strategic ambiguity, whatnot? I mean, what is your vision would be the right way for Australia to kind of come up with a foreign policy concept?
I think the starting point is to, I think, engage with both left, right, and centre, to talk about how neutrality is a good platform for the achievement of their traditional view of the world. And particularly on the right, it means, for the traditional concerns that the right has, which is that it wants to preserve Australia as a Western society with liberal values, that is able to deter any potential aggressor. There's a discussion to be had now about whether alignment with the United States is really compatible with those goals. Do you really want to be aligned with a nation that is clearly so volatile and unpredictable? It doesn't any longer make sense, given the logic that informs conservative thinking.
Right.
And then for people on the left, the argument is different. It's about saying, yes, we want to be a more independent country, but we are going to have to develop some significant capacities as a nation, which are underdeveloped at the moment, and that's going to include some military capacity. It's going to include, kind of surveillance and satellite technologies, which we're rather weak in, and these things we have to start thinking about. And that's a new field of debate for people on the left, but they're kind of beginning to realize that it's important to be thinking about that and to have something to say about that. So I think my approach in the short term is to say, look, for these different components of the society, neutrality can be embraced as a platform for achieving the things that you've traditionally wanted, and as a way of neutralizing some of the things that block you, because you're continually having to fight political arguments across the left-right lines, which are no longer, in many cases, are no longer necessary for you to have to fight anymore. Actually, we can find a lot of common ground here. The neutrality platform can enable us to do that.
Yes, absolutely. I completely think you're right in that thinking. And to the left, you can tell them, look, we can save all the stupid AUKUS money. And to the right, you can tell you can use that money in order to have your internal kind of defense thingies going on, okay? But like, let's take it away from here, and then we discuss how we're gonna use it on the other end. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Vern, for these insights. So, people who would like to write to you or to be in touch with you or to read about your neutrality thinking, where should they go?
Yeah, they can find me under my name. I think you will find me under my name, Vern Hughes, Australia, and there will be a number of links there which will get you in touch, and I'm very happy to respond to those inquiries.
Wonderful. If you send me a couple of links or something you would like me to propagate, then I will put them into the description box below, so people can click on them and find you and get in touch and talk about Australian neutrality and how to just get the ball rolling of that platform. And we will remain in touch as well, because we're building neutrality platforms now all over the place, which is also something more to look out for. Vern Hughes, thank you very much for your time today.
Wonderful. Thank you.